So let me formally welcome all of you for today's special webinar. The topic today is Public Debt in Historical Perspective. It is the latest book which has been released by Professor Barry Eichengreen. To chair the session today, we have Dr. Arvind Ramani, the chairman of EGROW Foundation. Dr. Ramani was the chief economic advisor of Government of India, and before that he had spent many years in the World Bank and many more years in Planning Commission. He was closely associated with policy making in our country and was also contributing significantly in the reforms that were brought in the country in 1991. He was also the executive director at International Monetary Fund in Washington and has been actively participating in policymaking debates even now after his return from the IMF. Having completed his PhD from Harvard, he has been at the World Bank and again contributing into policymaking. He has more than 30 articles in refereed journals and 3 books to his credit. I'm now inviting Dr. Arvind Ramani to chair the session today. Dr. Ramani, please.
Thank you, Charan. I guess as it's quite late, let me just start by giving a brief introduction and we can dive right in. So, Professor Eisenhower is a veteran. I mean, I've known his name from the first time I did development economics, but he is currently the George C. Pardee and Helen Pardee Professor of Economics and Professor of Political Science at the University of California in Berkeley, where he has taught since 1987. So he's been there consistently for a long time. He has been a research associate at the NBER, a research fellow at the Center of Policy Research in London, and also before that, he was a senior policy advisor in the Monetary Fund from 97 to 98. Just trying to think, I guess I was not around there at that time. And he is also a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He has many fellowships, etc., to his credit, but let me give some of his books. Among his, he has at least 8 books, which I have here, 2 of them on Korea, which is, I find interesting because I also did some work on Korea once long ago. And the most recent book is on public debt with co-authors, a book on economic grievances and political reactions, very interesting. Books on global currency and renminbi internationalization, a book on the dollar, and another book on the Great Depression and Great Recession. So numerous books across a wide variety of subjects, though today is going to be speaking on debt. Professor Eisenhower has also won many prizes, etc. And instead of going into a list of all those, let me now invite Professor Eisenhower to start his talk. Professor.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Virmani, and thank you to the EGROW Foundation for the opportunity to talk about my new book. So I was explaining a few minutes ago that the book is published by Oxford University Press. It is printed in the United States, and it will probably be some time before it's available in India because of the global container shortage. I find myself being negatively affected by the same supply chain disruptions that are depressing motor vehicle production worldwide. So no one is entirely immune from the fallout from the crisis. So the point of departure from the book is the observation that views of public debt have been changing in response to events. So if you're of my cohort, you will recall the 1980s and 1990s when there was growing concern about government's overspending, fears that public debt was on a dangerously unsustainable path. In the United States, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget was established in 1981, signifying that growing concern. Before the pandemic, when we could visit Times Square in New York, we could see this public debt clock on the side of a building above, ticking off the progressive rise in the debt and, as it were, every family's share. All of that was indicative of concern that government spending and debt were dangerously out of control. Then, of course, came the global financial crisis, when there was at least a temporary rethink of the role of public debt. In the United States, we adopted the $787 billion Obama stimulus, causing total public debt to shoot up from 64% of GDP to 84% of GDP in a little bit more than a year, as a result of large deficits and the decline of the denominator of the debt to GDP ratio. European countries forced to recapitalize their banking systems. In some cases, Ireland, for example, saw even larger increases in debt as a share of GDP. But that deviation from normal was temporary. Once recovery set in, and sometimes even before, governments turned back toward austerity, and the events of 2008, 2009 were dismissed as a temporary, if necessary, deviation from fiscal orthodoxy. Then came COVID-19. Now we see governments, not only in the United States, but around the world, including, of course, in India, running large deficits, accumulating unprecedented debts, at least debts that are unprecedented in peacetime. So the US federal government is running an extraordinary deficit of 13% of GDP. Debt in the hands of the public now exceeds 100% of GDP. Other countries have done likewise. Germany has abandoned its debt brake, its balanced budget rule, in favor of a deficit of more than 4% of GDP. In Europe, where the Maastricht Treaty mandates that debt should not exceed 60% of GDP, it exceeds 100% of GDP, not unlike that in the United States. And we witness now the peculiar scene of European Commission officials who traditionally chastise European governments for their excessive debts and deficits, instead now warning governments not to prematurely raise taxes or cut public spending. Leading to two obvious questions: is this change in attitudes and practices justified? And how long will it persist? Will that change in attitudes and practices, will it and can it last? On the first question, I would argue clearly, yes, the change is justified. Extraordinary circumstances like that, those of a global pandemic, justify extraordinary action. A government that does not respond to this kind of emergency by mobilizing all available resources, including resources that can only be mobilized by issuing debt, will not long retain its legitimacy. Politicians, when cautioning against deficits, tend to reason by way of analogy between the household budget and the government budget. We economists know that that analogy has its limits. Still, I think it's informative here. Under normal circumstances, in the same way that a responsible household should balance its budget and live within its means, so too should a responsible government. But these are not normal circumstances. A government that doesn't borrow in order to provide essential services during a deadly pandemic would be accused of dereliction, I think, and rightly so, in the same way that parents who do not borrow, who do not go into debt in order to obtain life-saving surgery for a child, would be rightly accused of dereliction. Indeed, history reminds us that states and rulers have long borrowed in order to meet emergencies, first and foremost, in order to finance defensive and sometimes offensive wars, in order to expand the realm, but also in order to survive, uh, borrowing to mount a sturdy national defense, strengthen the state in the material sense of successfully repelling invaders, but also in a political sense, since a state that provided an adequate national defense was seen as providing a valuable public service, seen as legitimate in the eyes of the public. The problem, and that's why we see public debt emerging in Europe before it emerges in other parts of the world, because war was especially prevalent in Europe from the Middle Ages and the early modern period. The European continent was divided into literally hundreds of princely kingdoms, many with many were no more than cities with very modest hinterlands. I show you here Europe's political geography circa 1200 and Europe's physical geography as a landmass divided by mountain ranges and river valleys posed natural obstacles to the formation of more extensive territorial states. So that made war the normal state of affairs. Contrast Europe with China at the same time. Much of China is a great plain, not the West perhaps, but much of China, meaning that war was less prevalent and peace could be secured more or less by building a great wall to the north. India fits uncomfortably into this distinction. Of course, this map of India circa 1795 reminds one that India too was divided into many kingdoms and princely states historically. So that's a reminder that it's not only the imperatives of war, but there other preconditions have to be met in order to issue public debt. What were those other preconditions? I'll come to them in a moment. A point that I want to make first is that one often hears that debts were accumulated in wartime and paid off in times of peace. Sometimes, as I will show you, but other times not. Increasingly over history, sovereign debt has persisted. Levels of indebtedness have risen over the centuries as states built the economic and financial and political infrastructure needed to service and maintain additional public obligations. The fundamental problem that had to be solved, of course, was the commitment problem. The king or the sovereign, we call it public debt sometimes, we call it sovereign debt other times. The king or the sovereign was traditionally regarded as the supreme earthly power, as synonymous with the state. As Louis XIV famously put it, the state is I. And the irony is that this unlimited power of the sovereign limited his ability to borrow, because there was nothing to prevent him from unilaterally reneging on his obligations. So it followed that historically, sovereigns could borrow only for short terms and at high interest rates, meaning that there were political and as well as economic and financial preconditions for accumulating and maintaining larger debts. The political preconditions were important. Sovereign debt began its rise to modern levels only with the creation of representative assemblies, in which the creditors sat, in which the creditors acquired the power to oversee tax collection, approve increases in spending, and authorize additional debt issuance. So in Europe, we see the creation of those representative assemblies, first in compact Italian city-states like Florence, Genoa, Venice, where it's easy for the creditors to assemble in one building, if you will, and then in territorial states, such as the Netherlands and England. So what you see with the creation of those representative assemblies and checks and balances on arbitrary action by the sovereign is that interest rates on sovereign borrowing begin to come down. I show you at the right the case of the Netherlands from 1600 to 1750. This political revolution occurs in the Netherlands in the 17th century, and you can see the quite dramatic decline in sovereign borrowing costs in the Netherlands over that century and a half as sovereign debt comes to be recognized as an obligation of the state rather than an obligation of the individual occupying the throne, as political checks and balances to arbitrary action by the crown, by the king, by the sovereign begin to be applied. And this debt is no longer an obligation of the individual occupying the throne, so the debt can outlive that one individual. In addition, there were economic preconditions for the growth of the market and sovereign borrowing. At the same time that real interest rates begin to come down, real growth rates begin to go up. So if you've been following the recent literature on public debt, you know about R minus G, where R is the real interest rate and G is the real growth rate of the economy. That difference, that expression, is important for the sustainability of sovereign debt. And I show you here the behavior of R minus G over the long run from 1800 into the 20th century. The 19th century is, of course, the marks the inauguration of modern economic growth, the Industrial Revolution in Europe and in Europe's overseas offshoots, Europe's overseas regions of recent settlement. As R minus G goes down, the heavier public debts become sustainable. The point being that modern public finance and modern levels of public debt are, in a sense, corollaries of modern economic growth. There are, and along with that, there has to be a market for this public debt. There has to be an adequate population of individuals with savings to invest. So it's not a coincidence that the same jurisdictions, political jurisdictions, that pioneer the issuance of public debt are the commercial centers of early modern and modern Europe. Venice, Genoa, then the Netherlands, and Britain were all major naval and commercial powers in their day, and the French towns that pioneered the placement of municipal and then sovereign debt were the homes to the champagne fairs that were the commercial centers of medieval and early modern Europe, as I illustrate here on the right. There were financial preconditions for being able to issue and place public debt. Successful debt issuers had to create secondary markets on which debt securities could be bought and sold so that investors could diversify their claims, limit their risks, sell their debt securities when they had liquidity needs. And creating and operating those markets generally required creating a central bank to backstop the market, ensuring its stability and liquidity. I show you the Bank of England, of course, on the right, with all of which had spillovers for private financial markets. So as government debt securities come to be seen as increasingly safe and markets in them become increasingly liquid, those public debt securities are accepted as collateral for other borrowing and lending transactions. So you get the growth of markets in private debt as a result of this growing sovereign debt issuance. The growth of the market in public debt spurs the broader process of economic and financial development. So there's a a classic question in economic history. Why was Europe first? Why was there a great divergence between Europe and its offshoots and the rest? In the 19th century, um, the growth of private financial markets is part of the story, and in turn, Europe's precocity in issuing public debt is part of the story of why Europe pioneered the growth of active, liquid, private financial markets. Over time, the uses of public debt have evolved. Financing wars remained and remains of premier importance. So I show you the debt to GDP ratio for the United States on the right, and you can see how public debt issuance in the United States is punctuated, dominated, if you will, historically by wars. But in addition, over time, starting mainly in the 19th century, governments also borrowed to invest in the infrastructure associated with modern economic growth, investing in roads, railways, ports, urban lighting, sewers, and so forth. And then in the very late 19th century and in the 20th century, governments began borrowing to finance social programs and transfer payments. So we as economists know that it makes sense to borrow in order to invest in productive infrastructure, which takes time to build, returns on which accrue over time. And as those returns accrue, returns can be used to finance that debt. It makes less sense to borrow to finance social programs and transfer payments, not all of which are equally productive, which spending all occurs now, pointing to the question of why these last expenditures couldn't also be financed out of current revenues. I think elements of an answer include the tendency of demands for social spending and transfer programs to rise precisely when the government's revenues fall, when times are tough. Secondly, political fractionalization. In a fractionalized polity, each political faction has just enough power to defend its preferred social programs, but not enough to force spending cuts on the preferred programs of others. This is Mansur-Olson's logic of collective action, if you will. And finally, political polarization combined with electoral uncertainty. So politicians will advocate more spending on their favored programs when they're in office, revenue constraints notwithstanding, since they know they will be in a weaker position to push for such spending later when they are possibly out of office. So as a result, public debt has shot up. That's how public debt acquired a bad name in the United States from the 1980s in a political system increasingly marked by political fractionalization and electoral uncertainty. So the duty of responsible political leaders, the conclusion followed, was to bring down now heavy debts to more reasonable levels. Leaders did what they could, some successfully, many not. Debts, as in the United States, shown you here at right, this is now debt in the hands of the public, remained uncomfortably high. So then came COVID-19. I think everyone recognized correctly that this public debt, this public health emergency was a crisis tantamount to war. It elicited a warlike fiscal response, as we have seen. The question, I think, now is whether this sea change in attitudes and actions will persist. Is the change in the fiscal landscape, the change in fiscal behavior in the United States, in India, elsewhere, simply the product of COVID-19 and no more? If so, won't the intellectual tide go back out, and won't we turn back to a more austere fiscal policy and attempt to bring higher debt levels back down after the pandemic, assuming hopefully that we can talk about after the pandemic? I'm not so sure. Certainly in the advanced countries, the change in attitudes in some sense predates COVID-19. Economists began to worry, many of us began to worry and complain about turning prematurely back toward austerity after the global financial crisis and dooming ourselves to a slow recovery from that crisis. Thomas Piketty and his emphasis on rising inequality and the need for a more expansive state to do something about those inequality problems predated COVID. The other two-handed economist here, who you will be familiar with, Raghu Rajan, was talking about fault lines and the need to address them before the pandemic. I think there was growing recognition of the need for government to provide public goods like education, healthcare, basic research, transportation infrastructure, climate change abatement that markets don't adequately provide left to their own devices. There was a recognition of the need to do that more expansively. Economic historians, American historians, talk about successive orders in the United States. There was the New Deal order when it was recognized that the state needed to do more, followed roughly from the 1980s by the neoliberal order, when it was argued the state should do less. Are we now arguably swinging back to the New Deal order? I think that argument can be made. In addition, lower interest rates make heavier public debts sustainable. So in the United States, federal government debt service cost just 2% of GDP in 2020, which was virtually unchanged from 2001, when debt in the hands of the public relative to GDP was barely 1/3 as high. So you can see that federal outlays on interest as a share of GDP in the 1990s here. You can see them now, that even though debt has gone up enormously, the federal government's interest payments have come down enormously. And the same is true elsewhere in the world, including in Europe. So the argument would go that the Maastricht Treaty limits on deficits and debt, a debt to GDP ratio of no more than 60% of GDP, is outdated because that calculation was predicated on a much higher interest rates than we observe now. The question being, of course, whether these low interest rates will persist, and your answer should depend on why you think interest rates currently are low. Are they low because of Mr. Bernanke's global savings glut and the high savings rates of Germany, Saudi Arabia, fast-growing emerging markets like China? Because life expectancy in the advanced economies has risen, and when people live more and look forward to more years of retirement, they save more when working? Is it because of the shift from manufacturing to services and from factories to digital platforms, which need less physical capital than steel mills? That is Mr. Summers' preferred explanation for the observed decline in real interest rates. Is it because of growing inequality and the disproportionately high savings rates of the wealthy? Depending on what you think, one can imagine interest rates will go up, that the savings rates of oil exporters will decline as demand for their petroleum dries up. Consumption in China could rise to more normal levels as the state there builds out the social safety net. Shifts in public policy could counter the trend toward increased inequality. And if interest rates go up, the debt arithmetic will become more problematic. So I show you here the standard familiar equation for debt dynamics. The change in the debt to GDP ratio, D over time depends on the government's budget surpluses, its primary budget surplus, excluding interest payments as a share of GDP, denoted here P, the inherited stock of debt D, and the interest rate, growth rate differential that we were talking about before, here expressed in nominal terms, and then everything else like involuntary debt conversions, debt defaults, and so forth, which go into the residual referred to here as the stock flow adjustment. So if interest rates go up, the point being, governments will face some hard choices. Historically, they have made the hard choice of running primary budget surpluses in cases where they successfully brought down heavy public debts. So here I show you three historical cases before World War I. The United Kingdom, when it brought down its Napoleonic War debt from nearly 200% of GDP to only 28% of GDP over the course of a century. The United States, when it brought down its Civil War debt of 30% of GDP to essentially nothing on the eve of World War I, and France, when it brought down a Franco-Prussian War debt of 100% of GDP to barely half that level on the eve of World War I. How did they do that? Entirely by running primary budget surpluses. Impressively, in the United Kingdom, over the course of a century. So I show you here the British case, where there was a Victorian belief in sound finance so that the government could borrow again in a future conflict, and the working class, which would have preferred inflation rather than deflation and more public spending, including finance by borrowing, had limited representation in Parliament. I show you here the US case where, again, there was strong creditor influence in the Congress and in politics more generally, and Southern states were opposed to expansive federal spending, which they saw as undermining social control of the Southern gentry. And here, France, where the elites saw fiscal restraint as building up the capacity to borrow again in a future war, looking forward to World War I. We also look in the book at some rather less happy cases, like Germany after World War I, where the public debt as a share of GDP was liquidated through hyperinflation. Clearly not something that anyone would want, an experience that anyone would want to repeat. And we look after World War II at how advanced economies brought down debt to GDP ratios of around 100% to barely a quarter of that around 1975 or so. So there are those who say that these heavy debts were brought down through financial repression, keeping interest rates low, through regulation, through relatively rapid economic growth during the 30 glorious years after World War II. The point I would make is there was, again, a lot of fiscal effort involved. Primary budget surpluses were run by many advanced economies for extended periods of time in order to bring down these initially heavy debts. So that brings us to the question of whether it could be done again, whether we can deal with our inherited debt load through by running persistent primary surpluses. My co-author Ugo Panizza and I have looked at this history from 1970 onward, and we have found only 3 cases of countries that were able to run primary budget surpluses of as large as 5% of GDP for as long as 10 consecutive years. The three cases were Norway after 1999, Belgium after 1995, and Singapore after 1990. What do these countries have in common? That they're very special cases. Normal countries cannot run primary budget surpluses as large as 5% for as long as 10 consecutive years, or so history suggests. Norway discovered massive amounts of oil and natural gas in the North Sea and was able to sock away much of that in its sovereign wealth fund for future generations. Belgium had the highest debt to GDP ratio in Europe and wanted to qualify for monetary union to adopt the euro in 1999. So it had to convince its partners that it was a reliable euro area country. And Singapore had a strong technocratic government worried about its geopolitical exposure. So the government could mandate, let's run primary surpluses and move our revenues again into our sovereign wealth funds. Normal countries can't do this. Can we, if not by growing out from under this debt burden, inflate away our debts? There are some economists, like my friend Charles Goodhart, who suggest that's what's coming. I have my doubts. I think investors can shift to short maturity debt. They will if they see more inflation coming. So there would have to be a big inflation surprise, a series of big inflationary surprises. And I do think, I doubt that our central banks will be prepared to sacrifice their hard-earned credibility by doing that. I think stability culture is now deeply ingrained in the central banking community. So yes, I think we will get 2 or 3 or possibly 4% inflation for a period of time, but not the kind of inflation that would be needed in order to inflate away the inherited debt burden. Can it be done through faster economic growth? That's what Europe is trying to do through its recovery fund. There are people who hope that the coming digital revolution will translate into faster economic growth in the United States and worldwide. History suggests that it will take time for that faster economic and productivity growth to eventuate. So I show you here a picture of Colonel Dwight D. Eisenhower's convoy. After World War I, the US military began to worry that they might have a Pacific War sooner or later. So Colonel Eisenhower was tasked with moving this convoy from the East Coast to the US West Coast, and it took him 3 weeks. So that was the impetus for developing the interstate highway system in the United States. The productivity benefits from which materialized really only in the 1960s and 1970s, after that highway system was largely completed in the 1950s. The point being that it takes time for general purpose technologies to translate into faster economic growth. All of which suggests to conclude that there are no simple solutions to our debt inheritance. History shows that countries that have successfully addressed problems of debt sustainability without major economic, financial, and political dislocations have done so by turning to fiscal restraint and running primary budget surpluses when the time is right and not before, by successfully growing their economies, and by running modest rates of inflation, avoiding deflation, which is not good from the point of view of debt sustainability. I think the lesson from history is failing to address the problem from all three angles is a recipe for disaster. So let me conclude on that note. I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Professor. Dr. Charan Singh, you have couple of books on debt. Would you want to start the process?
Yes, thank you so much. I was just mentioning to Professor that my work on debt management and separation of debt has happened with Robert Barrow at Harvard, and one of the PhDs from Berkeley, Professor Ross Melbourne. Professor Barry, I must tell you, this is an excellent book and we all need to buy. And you can imagine the interest in our country. This is the first time we have tried this time slot, and 68 people assembled here, and some of them policymakers, to listen to you. A very enlightening talk that you have given us. My quick question would be to Professor. First, this time after COVID, we have had a massive increase in debt. You have covered a very wide canvas in your research. In 1918, when the Spanish flu happened, did we see a similar surge in debt? And how long did it take to really even out and come back to normal levels? My second question is, Professor, the issue that you have raised is immensely important. Maastricht Treaty, 3%, 60% seems to have been written in gold and everybody had to follow it. I think you have brought in a new perspective of linking it with the interest rate prevalent then and saying that the interest rate regime is on the lower side. These ratios need to be recalculated, recalibrated. Would you or do you have any newer version of these two ratios? Thank you.
On the 1918-1919 Spanish flu pandemic, no, there was not a comparable surge in public debt at that time. The pandemic broke out toward the end of World War I, and there's an argument that it was transmitted mainly through military encampments. But the answer is that at the same time that military spending was being ramped down, there was a modest increase in health-related spending. So the two combined did not fuel a public debt surge that resembles what we see now. But there, in the wake of the Spanish flu, there were certainly severe problems of public debt management due to the debts incurred during the war itself. On the second question, I think we all have to make a judgment about what we think is going to happen to interest rates going forward, and recognize that there is a lot of uncertainty around that question. I am not a believer in magic numbers, so I was a critic of the Maastricht 3% deficit number and 60% debt number, even before people began to talk about secular stagnation and the secular decline in real interest rates. So I welcome the fact that the European Commission is going to reconsider those thresholds. And I hope that the new German government will do so as well. This is a prominent controversy in the German electoral campaign, which will conclude like a week and a half from now, with some parties like the Greens saying we need to reinvestigate, and others like the Christian Democrats saying absolutely not. I think what has come out of the scholarly literature is that it is better to strengthen fiscal institutions and procedures. You can more reliably put debt management and fiscal policy on a sustainable path by making the fiscal procedures more transparent, by delegating important fiscal responsibilities to independent fiscal councils, and so forth. So I would advise Europe. I would hesitate to give advice to the assembled experts about India, but I think as a general principle, it makes more sense to rely on stronger fiscal institutions rather than on arbitrary numbers whose relevance goes out the window when facts about potential rates of growth or real interest rates begin to change.
Mr. Chairman, if you permit me, can I ask one more question, or would you like
Yeah.
to go on to?
No, go ahead. Ask another one. Yeah.
Yeah, Professor, we have in our country been struggling with this idea of separating debt from monetary management. Now, given this in-depth study which you have attempted, we were arguing that if they are separated, monetary management can focus on the interest rate policy and debt management on the cost of borrowing. But then there were studies done at LSE, as well as there was a commission which said that during difficult times, especially after the Lehman Brothers, this separation is not fair and should not be undertaken. What would be your view? And would that be different for an advanced country with very sophisticated markets to an emerging country where the markets are still developing? Thank you.
I think the same general principle applies both for advanced countries and emerging markets, which is that this separation principle is important and valuable insofar as price stability has to be is one of the foundation stones for macroeconomic stability and economic growth. In national emergencies, that separation principle goes out the window. So during war, it goes out the window in the United States. During World War II, Federal Reserve policy was subordinated to the needs of the US Treasury. There was some conflict about restoring the independence of the Fed after World War II. It was finally successfully restored with the Treasury Fed Accord in 1951-52. So I think most economists would agree that the central bank independence should be buttressed and monetary and debt management policies should be separated except in extraordinary conditions. Then we have to confront the difficult fact that it's the politicians who basically decide when conditions are ordinary and extraordinary. Quantitative easing fuzzes up that distinction because the Treasury may be doing one thing to affect the debt, the maturity structure of the debt, and the central bank may be undoing that same thing through its asset purchase programs. So does a period when interest rates are becalmed at zero and central banks turn to QE, do those qualify as extraordinary circumstances when the central bank and the Treasury should work together in harness or not? So the principle is easy, the practice is hard, and that's always the case with economic policy.
Thank you. Let me just ask follow-up question. I'm sure you came across it in your book. You mentioned the primary surpluses. Did you also, or your co-authors, get into a little more details on the general pattern of how this was achieved? I mean, was it certain types of expenditure, neglect of capital expenditures? What did you get some sense of how this was done historically?
So we didn't look at the composition of public spending, which I know is a big issue in India. If we didn't attempt to construct a measure of the quality of public spending. So we looked at some of the political and macroeconomic preconditions. We did not find, for example, a big impact of the left wing versus right wing orientation of the government or so forth. But I think the subtext of your question that it would be important to look at the quality of public spending, how much productive public investment is in the budget might be important. So,
okay. Charan, is there any question or person you want to call on? I don't see.
Professor Ashima Goyal is with us today.
Oh, she
She's
is?
a member of the Monetary Policy Committee, and she was also a member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council.
Yeah, I don't see her. Ashima, are you there, Dr. Ashima? You want to ask something?
Yes, hello, Professor Aiken Green. Nice to hear you again. You visited IGIDR a couple of times and we've met. So I was just, this issue of R minus G and the borrowing cost of governments being low, advanced economies, but emerging markets. For example, in India, there's this fear that you will have outflows if debt goes high and interest rates could rise. And although the growth rate, the potential of higher growth is also there. So what is your view on borrowing to spend in COVID times for emerging markets? How can they find ways to do this?
I think it's a very positive sign that emerging markets were able to actively use fiscal policy, in other words, to borrow in order to help people put food on the table and enable people to stay out of COVID's way when we all went through lockdowns. So, I made the analogy with wartime in my presentation. There's no question in my mind that fiscal response was the right response to COVID, but now we have the debt inheritance to deal with. So if I understand the situation in India, you have a central government debt to GDP ratio of slightly under 70%. You have a interest rate on that debt on the order of 6 to 7%.
Right. And interest
And
payments come to about 3.5% of GDP.
And if you can grow the economy at the rate you were growing before 2018 or so, you can grow the economy faster than at a higher rate than the current rate of interest on the debt. So if all goes well, India's inherited debt ratio shouldn't be a problem. It's below 100%, and the growth rate of the economy, in principle, could exceed the interest rate on the debt. But that obviously is the scenario where everything goes right and growth returns to the faster rates that you were able to achieve before 2018 on a sustainable basis, and investor confidence is maintained, so interest rates don't go up. So that's the best case scenario, and I think wise economic policymakers prepare for other scenarios as well. So that's the argument for thinking about when to turn to fiscal consolidation. So I don't have a date for you there. I think about this on odd occasions. There are people in the room who think about it continuously.
So there are actually a number of projections, and the range is basically all they're showing is whether the peak will be earlier or later. So it's fairly comfortable, like exactly the calculation which you are suggesting, the G minus R, the range of growth rates and interest rates generally show, a peak, 5 years, 6 years, maximum 10 years from now, and a decline thereafter. So yeah. Charan, is anybody else there? Unfortunately, maybe if we can shut off the PowerPoint projection, I'll be able to see the people who are here. I don't.
Yeah, there are a couple of questions we could ask. There is a question from Anurag. There's a question from Aisha. Maybe we can invite them to ask a question themselves, because there are quite a few of subsections of the questions.
Okay, so Anurag first and then Aisha. You want to ask the question, Anurag? Be brief though. We plan to end,
Ramani sir, thanks for giving opportunity. Barry sir, you have very rightly explained the relationship of the GDP and the debt, and that too in detail. Now, I just want to know your view on the different other side of this ratio, that is GDP. In the present economic scenario, it is not only in India and the world, the digitalization is happening very fast, and the structural changes are taking in place in economy. So do you not think that the old methods of calculating the GDP should be changed? And if we do that, is it not this ratio which we suggest till now will change automatically?
So if I understood the question, it's really what's going to happen to productivity growth in the US,
Yeah,
in India, and globally
US.
going forward.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
Yes.
there
So
are,
if we take in, yeah, if we take into account this digitalization which is
Okay,
happening,
okay. Yeah,
and
let him answer, please, Anurag, now. Let him answer.
the data have shown an acceleration in productivity growth in the US and to a lesser extent in Europe. The question is, how much of that reflects composition? That it's the low productivity sectors where people have been laid off, less productive, lower paid people in restaurants and hospitality in the United States. Uh, when they go back to work, the productivity trend will return right back to where it was before the pandemic, if it's all compositional. Um, and how much of it reflects that we have learned how to become more productive workers, all of us, by using Cisco WebEx and through other innovations. The jury remains out. There's no evidence for the United States, for example, yet of a sustained acceleration in productivity growth. And as I showed you in my presentation, my reading of the history is that it will take time until whatever we've learned to do more productively in the pandemic translates into faster sustained productivity growth. Companies have to reorganize how they do business. Universities have to reorganize how we do teaching uh, in a more fundamental, systematic way before we see an acceleration in productivity growth. So it could happen, but it would be risky to make debt management policy on that basis now, because we don't know how much time will have to pass before that change materializes.
Okay, thank you. Anisha, you want to ask your question?
Thank you, Professor Singh. This is a question to Professor Aisha Green, and I have two disconnected points. The first one relates to, can we increase the amount of savings in an emerging or developing economy by increasing financial inclusion, deeper financial penetration? We know that in developing and emerging economies, people tend to save under their mattresses, cupboards, and other things, and rather than provide them with institutions where they could save, would that help in mopping up more savings for the economy? The second question is, can we, instead of linking it to, say, lower interest rates, the debt management be linked to welfare component? Now, this welfare could be an index across the social indicators, and we continue to borrow as long as we have the maximum marginal benefit out of having debt, and slowly reduce it with maximum or higher levels of welfare being achieved. Thank you.
So those are good questions both. On the first one, higher savings rates in emerging markets would translate into more sustainable public debt insofar as those higher savings rates affected the relevant interest rate. By and large, we think that more savings means lower interest rates, everything else equal. There is the question of whether that additional saving will go into government bonds. Are they regarded as safe assets that will hold their value, or into holding more jewelry, more precious metals under the mattress? So more savings by itself doesn't everywhere and always translate into more sustainable public debts. On the other question, I guess the way I would respond is that there's an important distinction between productive public investment and current public spending, a debate that we're getting wrong in the United States at the moment. So we're having a debate about whether the government should borrow in order to invest in productive physical infrastructure and productive social infrastructure, such as spending more on early childhood education, which translates into more productive workers and faster economic growth for decades thereafter. And there are people who oppose additional spending on productive government investment wrongly, I think. just because they are opposed to incurring more public debt, no matter what the government is investing in. So I think, as your question suggested, looking at the social consequences of that government spending is an important part of this debate.
Okay.
Can we take one last question from Nagesh?
I have a question.
So just a second, Nagesh has written his question. So let Nagesh ask. And what is your good name? Palak?
Palak Jain.
Let me ask, sir, would professor have time to spend another 5 minutes?
Yep.
Let's take whatever questions together, and then you can just answer, and we'll conclude. So very quickly, all the questions together.
Okay.
Okay,
So
sir.
Anurag, you could go, and then Palak can go. Oh, Nagesh, let
Yes, sir.
Nagesh go first, and then Palak can go.
Sir, in very brief, I wanted to ask you the number of 100% to GDP public debt ratio or Maastricht Treaty of 3.5 to 4%. So what is the rationality behind it? Number one. Number two, how to increase the ratio of committed expenditure to capital expenditure or productive expenditure. In India, it's almost 90% at the central level is committed expenditure. Even the ratio almost same or similar in case of state governments. How to reverse it and how to increase the leakages, as you have noted, more number of fiscal institutes, independent institutes, and how to make them work efficiently, and some tools to can you enlighten intergenerational public debt liability, even the aging factor, which leads to a lot of public expenditure today, and that may have intergenerational effect.
Okay.
Thank you.
Palak Jain, quick question, Palak.
Yes, sir. I just want to ask you that uh, due to this COVID, so as government is facing huge deficit, so how can disinvestment help in this?
And Navdeep, last question. You also add your question. Navdeep Singh.
Hello, sir. Sir, so my question is that can you elaborate on about the public debt management in the various states of USA, and how is it different from the federal government? And uh, how should Indian states manage their public debt with reducing fiscal autonomy?
Professor,
Okay, thank you. So,
Professor,
Professor, just
Professor,
take
actually,
whatever questions you. Yeah.
Yeah, I would just like to clarify to you, in India, we have this federal and the provincial. The provincial is generally called state governments. The federal is called the central government. So the last question brought in the state government.
Okay, okay, sir. Thank you.
So I am by no means an expert on fiscal federalism in India and the relations between the states and the central government. In the United States, the states are required by their own constitutions or by legislation that's been on the books for more than a century to basically run balanced budgets. So they have some special authorities that can do limited borrowing. They accumulate rainy day funds, surpluses during good times that they can run down during bad times. So, and the reason we have these restrictions on state borrowing is because many US state governments defaulted on their debts in the 1830s and 1840s, and it had to pass these laws in order to begin to restore fiscal normalcy. So I think it is important more generally for state governments to have hard budget constraints one way or another. Other federal fiscal systems with which I'm familiar, like Brazil's, in the old days, they didn't have those hard budget constraints on the states, and the states got into trouble, had to be bailed out by the central or federal government, resulting in heavier debts. They now have legally mandated hard budget constraints. So not knowing anything about India's fiscal federalism, my guess would be it is important to harden the budget constraints for the states.
Okay, so right, so that's fine. I guess, well, let me thank you because getting a bit late here. So let me thank you and hand it over to Charan to conclude.
So I must thank the chairman for chairing this session today. This is the first time we've experimented a 9 p.m. to 10 p.m. session, and given the book and the knowledge about Professor Barry Green and the work that he does, we have had about 68 participants today, which I think at such an odd time is really, really very big number. And we are so thankful for the participants who have spent time with us. I must thank Professor Barry Green for sharing his book with us. I think we all need to buy his book because the way he has explained the details that he has gone in and the historical perspective that he has presented in his book going back as far as 1600 seems to be very, very rich. I think we all need to go and get this book for ourselves. And India and the world is facing this debt crisis and rising debt these times. The arguments that he has provided to us and the commission which is re-looking at the Maastricht Treaty figures is also important. So gives us a complete perspective of debt management in the world and in our country. Otherwise, we get so much bogged down by rating agencies breathing down our neck and saying, hey, you have crossed 3%, your debt is above 60%. And I think scholarly work of Professor Green can help emerging countries like ours. So I thank you, Professor, for agreeing to come and spend time with us. I know it's pretty early morning there, and you have agreed to come and make this presentation. We have, in a way, crossed the time barrier, extreme side of the earth, and we've still been able to find time to sit together. By tomorrow noon, the recording of Professor Green's lecture will be available with us, and all of us can use it the way we want. I'm sure we can use it in our classrooms as well as I think policymakers will benefit from it. Next week, so happy to say, Professor Galina Hale, now at UC, I think Santa Cruz, and earlier advisor at Fed Reserve, is going to deliver a talk. And the topic is spillovers. She's also a student of Professor Green. So I would invite all of you to please come and participate in that. She will be speaking from 8 p.m. to 9 p.m. So next week, we go back to our standard time of 8 p.m. to 9 p.m. Professor Galina Hale from University of California, Santa Cruz. All the best. The recording will be available tomorrow and look forward to your participation next week. Thank you very much. And good night.